The guns in Gaza have fallen silent, hostages are finally coming home, but peace is not here, not yet. Because what's happening now isn't the end of the war, it could be the prelude to something far more dangerous, something that could redefine America's security and its power for decades to come. After more than 780 days of war, the unthinkable has finally happened. Israel and Hamas have agreed to a ceasefire. The first Israeli hostages have been released, and in return, Israel has begun freeing hundreds of Palestinian prisoners. On the surface, it looks like a turning point, a moment when guns fall silent and diplomacy takes the stage. But this is more than just a truce. It's the first real attempt to reshape the balance of power in the region, and it carries Washington's signature at every step. What's unfolding now is not just about Gaza's future, it's a test of America's influence, its credibility, and its ability to shape events before they spiral out of control. In this video, we'll break down what's really behind the deal, why peace is far from guaranteed, and what risks and opportunities lie ahead for the United States. If you want clear analysis without hype, subscribe to the channel. To see what's at stake, let's begin with the new facts. On October 12, 2025, after more than 780 days of conflict, Israel and Hamas officially activated a ceasefire that abruptly paused fighting. Under that arrangement, Hamas has released all 20 remaining living Israeli hostages, handing them over via the Red Cross in phases, while Israel has begun freeing nearly 2,000 Palestinian prisoners. The deal also includes the return of the bodies of 28 deceased captives. The exchange coincided with President Trump's arrival in the region and his symbolic address to Israel's parliament. This ceasefire isn't a standalone gesture. It is the foundation of what the White House calls its 20-point Gaza peace plan. The first stage is clear: hostages for prisoners, withdrawal of Israeli forces to agreed lines to enable humanitarian flows, and resumption of aid deliveries. Then the plan shifts to political architecture, demilitarizing Hamas, decommissioning weapons, and supplanting its governance role with a technocratic interim authority under international supervision. The framework envisions a security guarantee apparatus and border regimes contingent on Hamas complying with disarmament and oversight. Washington is betting this sequence will work. After years of conflict that eroded U.S. influence, the goal is to reassert leverage, stop the violence, win goodwill, and then press the tricky moves of power, legitimacy, and governance before opposing actors can sabotage the process. For Israel, it's a chance to secure hostages and reduce physical engagement. For Hamas, it's survival in the short term, but only if it concedes substantial control. But make no mistake, even the most meticulously drafted peace architecture is full of fault lines. Demilitarizing an insurgent group with decentralized weapon stockpiles is messy. Replacing de facto power with technocracy raises questions of legitimacy and consent. Governance without representation breeds resistance. In the next block, we'll ask one of the most fundamental questions of all: can this even succeed if the Palestinian voice was never part of the design? But here's where the cracks in this carefully built framework start to show. In the first phase, Washington's plan focuses on hostages, weapons, and security, all tangible elements that can be measured, verified, and negotiated. But when it comes to the deeper political future of Gaza and the broader Palestinian question, one voice has been almost entirely absent from the table: the Palestinians themselves. Hamas, which many governments still classify as a terrorist organization, was part of the negotiations because it controlled the hostages and the territory. But beyond that narrow transactional role, there has been no structured consultation with any recognized Palestinian political body about what comes next. The Palestinian Authority, the internationally recognized government based in the West Bank, was not a signatory to the plan, nor were independent Palestinian civil society groups or representatives of Gaza's population. The result is that the political blueprint shaping Gaza's future has been written without direct input from the people who will actually live with its consequences. This is not a new problem in Middle Eastern diplomacy. Over the last 3 decades, major initiatives, from the Oslo Accords of the 1990s to more recent normalization deals between Israel and Arab states, have often been negotiated above the heads of the Palestinian population. They have been shaped by external actors, designed in foreign capitals, and then presented as faits accomplis to the people most affected. Those agreements sometimes produce short-term stability, but rarely produced lasting peace, because the legitimacy needed to sustain them never truly existed. Here too, the same risk is built into the current process. There is no serious discussion in the framework about Palestinian self-determination, the principle that a people must have the right to decide its political future. There is no clear plan for how final borders will be defined, or how 2 states might coexist side by side. There is no roadmap for mutual recognition, which remains the cornerstone of any durable agreement. Instead, the plan speaks the language of security, demilitarization, and administration, terms that resonate in Washington and Jerusalem, but often sound hollow in Rafah or Khan Yunis. That disconnect matters, because a ceasefire imposed from above can stop the guns, but it cannot erase resentment. A technocratic government installed by foreign powers may restore basic services, but it cannot substitute for political agency. And a demilitarization process that strips armed groups of power without offering people a voice risks being seen not as peace building, but as occupation by another name. That perception alone can turn passive acceptance into active resistance. For the United States, this is not a theoretical concern. It's a strategic vulnerability. If the Palestinian population views the agreement as illegitimate, pressure will grow on Hamas or on successor groups to sabotage the process. Local opposition could harden into organized resistance, making governance impossible and fueling a new cycle of violence. And if that happens, Washington's carefully designed plan could unravel before it ever reaches its next phase. So the question we must ask is as simple as it is uncomfortable. Can a peace framework truly succeed if the people it is supposed to serve were never invited to shape it? History suggests the answer is no. And without legitimacy, every ceasefire, no matter how promising, risks becoming the fuse that lights the next explosion. The absence of a real Palestinian voice isn't just a political gap, it's a strategic vulnerability. And Washington knows it. That's why the United States is pouring energy, capital, and credibility into this fragile process, trying to turn a short pause in fighting into a lasting shift in the region's balance of power. This is not routine diplomacy, it's a gamble, a calculated bet that American influence can still shape outcomes in one of the world's most volatile arenas. In the weeks leading up to the ceasefire, U.S. diplomats worked relentlessly behind the scenes. Reuters reports that Washington coordinated closely with Qatar and Egypt even before the deal was finalized, using their channels to pressure Hamas and secure the release of hostages. Once the agreement was in place, the White House moved fast to build momentum. President Trump's arrival in Israel and his speech to the Knesset were more than symbolic moments. They were a signal that America was taking ownership of the process. That role now unfolds on several fronts. Operationally, Washington is deeply involved in coordinating humanitarian corridors and ensuring hundreds of aid convoys can move safely into Gaza, a vital condition if the ceasefire is to hold. Politically, American officials are working to turn a narrow hostage exchange into a broader platform for negotiation, one that could bring regional actors into the fold and lay the foundations for governance and reconstruction. According to AP, those talks include sensitive discussions on border control, long-term security guarantees, and the eventual transition to a new administrative authority once Hamas is disarmed. But this effort is about more than Gaza. It's a message to allies and adversaries alike that U.S. diplomatic leverage still matters, that when Washington chooses to act, coalitions form and realities shift, and that message is urgently needed. In recent years, doubts about American staying power have multiplied.
Moscow's reaction to the ceasefire, cautious praise mixed with skepticism about its longevity, reflects that skepticism. Beijing, too, has portrayed U.S. involvement as inconsistent and unreliable. If this initiative succeeds, it silences those criticisms. If it fails, it proves them right. For President Trump, the stakes reach far beyond the Strip. The mission is to stabilize a region that remains vital to U.S. energy security, global trade, and counterterrorism efforts. Success would reassert Washington as the indispensable power, the one nation capable of brokering deals, containing escalation, and shaping the next chapter of Middle Eastern history. But failure would do the opposite. Every missed deadline, every sign of hesitation, every diplomatic misstep chips away at America's credibility and opens space for rivals to move in. And they're already moving. Moscow has deepened its foothold in Syria and tightened its alliance with Tehran. Beijing is wooing Gulf states with lucrative trade and security partnerships. Iran, meanwhile, is testing U.S. resolve through a web of proxy militias that thrive on instability. A collapsed peace process would hand each of them an opportunity not to confront the U.S. directly, but to fill the vacuum it leaves behind. This is Trump's wager. If the ceasefire holds, governance takes shape, and disarmament advances, Washington could claim a rare strategic victory in a region where its influence has been slipping. But if the plan buckles under its own weight, under the lack of legitimacy, unresolved power struggles, or external sabotage, the consequences won't stop at Gaza's borders. Aid convoys could grind to a halt. Negotiations could freeze. New conflicts could ignite. And America's reputation as a reliable power could suffer a blow far more damaging than any military defeat. Because in the end, this is not just about stopping a war. It's about proving that the United States can still shape the peace. And before we understand how fragile that peace is, we need to look beyond Gaza itself. But even if Washington gets everything right, if the ceasefire holds, if governance starts to take shape, if disarmament proceeds, the real test may still come from outside Gaza. Because beyond the narrow frame of the agreement lies a wider battlefield, one shaped by actors who were never part of the deal, who reject its premises, and who have every reason to see it fail. Chief among them is Iran. For decades, Tehran has positioned itself as the self-declared patron of what it calls the axis of resistance, a loose network of armed groups across the Middle East united by their opposition to Israel and the United States. Iran provides these groups with funding, weapons, intelligence, and political cover, allowing it to project power far beyond its borders while maintaining plausible deniability. Its influence extends into Gaza through Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, into Lebanon through Hezbollah, into Syria and Iraq through Shiite militias, and into Yemen through the Houthis. None of these actors signed on to the Trump peace framework. None are bound by its terms, and all of them have the capacity to disrupt it. Hezbollah is the most dangerous example. Its arsenal of more than 150,000 rockets, many capable of reaching deep into Israeli territory, is a constant reminder that a second front could ignite in days, not weeks. Tensions along the Israel-Lebanon border have already flared multiple times since the ceasefire was announced, with rocket fire and Israeli retaliatory strikes testing the limits of restraint. A single miscalculation, a rocket that hits a civilian area, a retaliatory strike that kills a senior commander, could collapse the ceasefire and plunge the region into a wider conflict. In Syria and Iraq, Iran-backed militias present a different but equally serious challenge. These groups operate with varying degrees of autonomy, but their actions often align with Tehran's strategic goals. They have targeted U.S. bases with drones and rockets in the past, and they could do so again if they perceive the Gaza deal as a threat to Iran's influence, or as an opportunity to stretch American forces thin. In Yemen, the Houthis have already demonstrated their ability to hit shipping lanes in the Red Sea, a move that disrupts global trade and puts additional pressure on Washington to respond. Each of these flashpoints is a potential spoiler. capable of forcing the U.S. and Israel to divert attention and resources away from Gaza just when the fragile diplomatic process needs stability the most. And it's not just about direct attacks. Iran and its proxies excel at what strategists call gray zone operations, actions that fall below the threshold of conventional war but still achieve strategic effects. Cyber attacks, covert sabotage, arms smuggling, targeted assassinations, these tools are harder to attribute and easier to deny, but they can be just as effective in derailing a peace process. A single successful attack on Israeli infrastructure or a surge of weapons into Gaza despite demilitarization efforts could erode trust and reignite hostilities before the political track even begins. For Israel, this reality means that victory in Gaza, however it's defined, cannot guarantee security on its northern, eastern, or southern borders. For the United States, it means that military posture in the region will remain a balancing act, deterring Iran and its proxies without escalating into open war, protecting U.S. assets and personnel while sustaining diplomatic momentum, and coordinating with regional partners who often have conflicting priorities. This is why American aircraft carriers continue to patrol the eastern Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf, why missile defense systems have been deployed to bases across the region, and why intelligence cooperation with allies has intensified since the ceasefire took hold. The uncomfortable truth is that the war in Gaza could end tomorrow and the region would still be on a knife's edge. Because for Tehran, Hezbollah, and the constellation of militias it supports, the battlefield is not a single strip of land, it's the entire Middle East. And in that larger arena, a peace deal brokered in Washington is not the end of the fight, it's an invitation to open a new one. So we have to ask, is the war truly over? Or has it simply shifted to a front that is even more volatile, more complex, and far harder to control? Even if the ceasefire survives external pressure, even if Iran holds back, Hezbollah stays quiet, and proxy militias don't light new fires, the plan faces a threat just as dangerous: the politics within. Because no peace deal, no matter how well designed, can hold if the key players are too divided to sustain it. And right now, both Israel and Hamas are fighting internal battles that could tear the process apart from the inside. In Israel, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is walking one of the thinnest political tightropes of his career. His coalition, one of the most ideologically fragmented in the country's history, is under fire from every direction. On the right, hardliners see the ceasefire as a historic mistake. They view any pause as betrayal and demand a return to full-scale military operations until Hamas is not just weakened, but erased. Several ministers have even hinted they could collapse the government if deeper concessions are made. From the center and left, the criticism is different but just as intense. Opposition leaders accuse Netanyahu of lacking a clear strategy, of drifting from crisis to crisis without a defined endgame. Families of hostages, once among his staunchest supporters, now protest outside his residence. And with elections likely within a year, public opinion could determine whether this government even survives long enough to implement the plan it started. That opinion is deeply split. For many Israelis, the images of hostages returning home are a moment of relief, proof that diplomacy can achieve what force alone could not. But for others, those same images symbolize weakness. They believe Israel traded leverage for optics and gained little in return. That divide runs from the cabinet table to the street, and it could harden into paralysis if the process falters or if violence returns. Hamas faces a different but equally dangerous crisis. The movement is trapped between two instincts: the cold pragmatism of negotiation and the uncompromising ideology that has defined it since its founding. Some leaders see the ceasefire as a lifeline, a chance to preserve political relevance, retain influence over Gaza's social networks, and maybe even secure a role in whatever governance structure comes next. Others reject any compromise as treason. They vow to keep fighting, no matter the cost. Those divisions are not theoretical. In the past, splinter groups have broken away from Hamas and launched independent attacks to sabotage ceasefires. That danger remains. A single rogue unit could detonate months of diplomacy in a single afternoon, and Hamas leadership knows that if it concedes too much, if disarmament looks like surrender, its legitimacy could collapse, paving the way for Islamic Jihad or newer, more radical factions to take its place. Public opinion among Palestinians is just as polarized and just as combustible. Some see the ceasefire as a desperately needed pause, a chance to rebuild lives shattered by war. Others view it as a trap, a U.S.-imposed framework that offers no real path to sovereignty. That anger is especially sharp in Gaza, where trust in any peace initiative is near zero and resentment toward both Hamas and Israel is rising fast. This is the reality beneath the headlines. Two societies exhausted by war, yet divided over peace. Both are led by governments under siege from within. Both are struggling to hold together fragile coalitions, and both know that a single political misstep could collapse the entire structure. And that matters because diplomacy doesn't exist in a vacuum. It lives or dies by domestic politics. If Netanyahu's coalition falls, if Hamas splinters, if public opinion turns decisively against compromise, then the greatest obstacle to peace won't be rockets or militias. It will be the will of the people themselves. So far, the ceasefire is real, but it's built on shifting sand. And unless those political foundations are stabilized soon, the entire project could sink before it ever stands. Every layer we've explored so far, from external pressure to domestic politics, points to one truth. The ceasefire is real, but it's also precarious. And that means the road ahead could branch in several very different directions. Each path carries its own logic, its own risks, and its own consequences, not just for Israel and the Palestinians, but for Washington and the global order it's trying to shape. The first and most optimistic scenario is the one the Trump administration is betting on. A stable ceasefire that evolves into a broader political settlement. In this version of the future, demilitarization proceeds as planned. Humanitarian aid expands, and a technocratic transitional authority supported by international donors and overseen by regional partners begins to manage Gaza's reconstruction and governance. Over time, that administrative structure could open the door to more ambitious negotiations. Final status talks on borders, security guarantees, and the parameters of a two-state solution that has eluded diplomats for decades. If this happens, the regional picture shifts dramatically. Arab states that normalized relations with Israel could deepen their cooperation, while others might join the process. Trade and infrastructure projects linking the Mediterranean to the Gulf could accelerate, and Washington, having brokered the breakthrough, would solidify its role as the indispensable power in the Middle East, proving that American diplomacy can still deliver order in a region defined by chaos. But that is the best-case scenario, and history suggests it's also the least likely. A more plausible outcome is the second path, a fragile and temporary ceasefire that slowly erodes under the weight of unresolved tensions. In this scenario, neither side resumes full-scale war immediately, but neither side fully commits to peace either. Aid trucks keep moving, but demilitarization stalls. Governance talks drag on without real progress. Israeli politics remain gridlocked, Hamas remains divided, and mutual distrust festers. Skirmishes, rocket fire, and tit-for-tat strikes become routine, each one testing the limits of restraint, but never quite tipping the region back into total war. This slow-motion breakdown would be dangerous precisely because it looks manageable until it's not. It would trap Washington in a cycle of crisis management, forcing U.S. diplomats to spend months or years firefighting rather than shaping strategy. It would also erode credibility over time. If the plan fails to produce meaningful change, both allies and adversaries will start to question whether American leadership can translate ambition into results. And while the conflict might remain contained, it would still bleed resources, attention, and political capital that the United States could otherwise direct toward competition with China or Russia. The third scenario, the worst-case outcome, is a complete collapse of the deal and a return to full-scale war. In this future, the ceasefire unravels entirely. Israel resumes major ground operations in Gaza, backed by an expanded air campaign aimed at dismantling what remains of Hamas's infrastructure. Civilian casualties climb into the tens of thousands, and a humanitarian disaster unfolds on a scale that dwarfs anything seen so far. Regional actors respond in kind. Hezbollah opens a northern front, Iran ramps up support to its proxies, and the Houthis strike shipping lanes in the Red Sea. American military assets in the region come under renewed attack, forcing Washington to make difficult choices about escalation and deterrence. The implications of that scenario would be profound. The U.S. would face pressure, both from allies and from domestic opinion, to do more to stop the fighting, potentially drawing it deeper into a conflict it has tried to manage from the sidelines. Relations with Arab partners could fracture, especially if civilian casualties spark unrest across the region. And the credibility of U.S. diplomacy would take a major hit. A process that was meant to showcase American leadership would instead become a symbol of its limits. Perhaps most dangerously, rivals like China and Russia would seize the moment to present themselves as alternative brokers, capitalizing on Washington's perceived failure to extend their own influence. What makes this worst-case scenario so destabilizing is not just the scale of violence, but the ripple effects it would unleash far beyond the Middle East. Energy markets would surge, global shipping routes could face sustained disruption. American attention, already stretched thin by competition in Europe and the Pacific, would be dragged back into a region it has been trying to pivot away from for over a decade. And with elections looming in the United States, a prolonged conflict could reshape the domestic political landscape as well. These three futures, breakthrough, stalemate, collapse, are not just theoretical models. They are real possibilities, and the choices made in the coming weeks will determine which one becomes reality. The uncomfortable truth is that Washington has more influence over these outcomes than any other actor, but it does not have total control. It can build coalitions, provide incentives, and deter escalation, but it cannot erase decades of mistrust, rewrite political realities, or eliminate the motivations of those determined to see the process fail. And that leads to the most pressing question of all: is the United States truly prepared for the worst-case scenario? Because if the gamble behind this peace process backfires, the cost won't just be measured in rockets and ruins, it will be measured in America's power, credibility, and place in the world. A ceasefire can stop the bombs. A prisoner exchange can bring families back together. But none of that, not the silence on the battlefield, not the signatures on a document, can resolve the deeper forces that have kept this conflict alive for generations. The roots of this crisis are political, historical, and profoundly human, and they cannot be bombed out of existence or negotiated away in a single round of talks. They require choices, hard, costly, deliberate choices that will have to be made in the weeks and months ahead. What happens next will not be decided by tanks or drones. It will be decided in cabinet meetings in Jerusalem and in leadership councils in Gaza. It will be shaped by conversations in Washington, Tehran, and Doha. And it will depend on whether leaders are willing to confront the realities they have long tried to avoid: the need for legitimacy, the demand for representation, the question of how two peoples can coexist on the same land without destroying each other. The world is watching the ceasefire as if it were the end of something, but history suggests it may only be the beginning, either the fragile first step toward a new regional order or the opening chapter of a conflict even harder to contain. The decisions made now will echo far beyond Gaza, far beyond the Middle East, and far beyond this moment. They will shape the balance of power, the credibility of nations, and the security of millions. So we're left with the question that matters more than any headline. Are we standing at the start of peace, or merely in the eye of the storm? What do you think? Is this the beginning of peace, or just the eye of the storm? Tell us in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for clear, fact-based analysis without the noise.